my pleasure to welcome Stephen Whittle. Could you please give him a massive Pride in Leadership welcome?
You should have seen my wife's face when you said that.
What, just your name?
No, I want him to talk as much as possible.
Well, where do we start? The beginning? Tell us about your young life.
My young life? Well, I'm a Manchester born and bred person, born in Wythenshawe, brought up there until we moved to Withington. Do you know, I mean, people often ask me about my childhood, and I don't have a great deal of memory of it, because I think for a very long time I suppressed all of those thoughts, all the things that I'd gone through as a kid. I mean, the shorthand version was always, I was a deeply unhappy child. I was a truly, truly miserable teenager. And then I became Stephen, and it all worked out. So, you know, that's the sort of simple version. But I was born in 55. People like me didn't exist then. Except, well, when I was about 11 or 12, they started to appear in the Sunday newspapers like the News of the World and the Sunday People, and they had stories about sexual perverts like April Ashley. And I used to just sort of shove it inside the middle of the Daily Express so nobody could actually see what I was reading, or at least I hope nobody could see what I was reading, the Sunday Express. So apparently they could all see what I was reading. When I eventually told my parents that I wanted to do this, my mum said, "Oh dear, I had hoped you might manage just by being a sort of butch lesbian." And I almost fainted at that point, because this was 1973. How on earth did my mother know the word lesbian? She was the person who switched off the telly when people kissed. But my dad walked in the room and said, "What are you talking about?" We explained, and he said, "We've been waiting for this since you were 2. We always knew it'd happen one day." And that was it. And I often think now, as we talk about kids and conversion therapy, and the idea that some places think that kids who feel that they might be trans should be persuaded not to be. My parents never once persuaded me not to be. It was always, well, yeah, it's obvious. And thank God for that.
Is that pretty impressive for the time, would you say?
I think they may not have known that there was any alternative at the time, that maybe they could have taken me to see somebody who might cure me. But it was just sort of, they'd always known that it was going to happen one day. I mean, my dad just said it was so clear. You know, you spent until you were 8 playing with the boys, and then I told you couldn't do, and then you were just miserable.
Mm. And so what age were you when you had this conversation with your
folks? I was 18.
Okay.
I was 18, so I'd managed to find, I was trying to be a very good lesbian, only that it just didn't work. And I'd gone to the last Women's Liberation Conference in this country, up in Edinburgh. And on the last night, all the women had gone into a main hall and done circle dancing naked. And you know when you just realise that you could never quite be that person? And on the bus home, I thought I'd just have to tell the women I was with, who were very nice, they were lovely. And we got back and I said, I feel a bit of a fraud. I need to tell you that actually I want to be a man. And it was astonishing. They went, "Oh, yeah, obviously." And the next thing is, you know, Maggie had run off and was going into the back of her wardrobe because she had a suit and a tie from her past butch days as a lesbian. And somebody else was this, and somebody else said, "Oh, and there's that club out in Ashton, and there's a transsexual woman who goes there. We could take you there." And they did the next night, and I met Cal Steele and Stan and Linda and various other people. And within 2 weeks, we'd started the very first support group for trans people here in the UK, here in Manchester. After about a month, Stan's flat was absolutely full of people. They were down the stairs, because where we were holding it, I mean, Roy, who used to serve tea wearing a sort of latex outfit, just didn't have enough cups for everybody in the end. We knew we had to find somewhere bigger. And there was a new chaplaincy had been built on Oxford Road by Manchester University. There was a joint chaplaincy between the universities at that point. So somebody said they've got rooms to rent. So went off to see them and knocked on the door, having arranged an appointment, knocked on the door. I was wearing my best tie and jacket and everything, and Carol was wearing her best outfit. And the person who opened the door was my scripture teacher from school. I had actually left school at that point, but not very long left school. And you know, that point where you just go, God, just rend the floor apart. Give us an earthquake now this minute so I can disappear off into the magma because I really don't want to do this. And they were great. And they gave us a room at the back that was directly accessible to the car park with changing facilities. And they just did everything to make it work. And it was amazing. And I think my friend Alex is here somewhere over there. He came to the second meeting. And I remember thinking, he said he knew I was okay because I had a dog on a string. In those days, I used to find dogs and walk around with them on strings. And we've been friends ever since. And
what I'm finding remarkable about this story is there's two of you, and you've set up a movement straight away, very, very quickly, but equally, the amount of allyship available at that time.
People genuinely acknowledged that this was difficult, that clearly it wasn't acceptable to middle-class England. But, you know, this was Manchester. And Manchester, even though we didn't have a village at that point, we only had a few bars, we had Napoleon's, we had the Union, etc. There was this sort of general awareness that people were gay or lesbian or even trans, though people often didn't know what that meant, and a willingness to get to know people. And actually within a very short space of time, within about 2 years, we'd linked up with groups all over the country, new groups that had formed because we'd formed. We'd also linked up with gay and lesbian groups. I used to work as a technician here at Manchester Metropolitan University in the Poly. And my boss called me in one day and said, "What the hell is wrong with you? You're like just not together. You do your job really well, but the rest of your life seems to be falling apart." And I think I sort of went, "I want to have a sex change." And he went, "Oh, right, yeah, sure, we could sort that out." And he did. He did. I took a fortnight off from work. The psychiatrist had told me I had to live with Stephen before he could ever consider treatment. And I had to do 3 months and see a psychologist, so I did all that. But Ray at work just sorted it out. He said he's doing it, that's it. It also helped that the shop steward for the technicians, technical staff, was gay, and his partner was worked at Manchester City Council, was also gay, and he was very active when we sort of started saying the village needed to be safer space. But he just went round. They also ran the best gay disco in the country here at Manchester Polytechnic once a week. And, you know, God, we used to have wonderful evenings there. And it was a genuinely, we mixed up with people at the other university and with Salford. And before we knew what, we were actually fitting out the Manchester Gay Switchboard. And
how many years are passing here?
2 at most. I
remember.
remember,
20?
Yeah, so I was about 20 when Tony, somewhere to here, I said, "Hey," no, it wasn't Tony, it was somebody else. But I said, "Hey, the Polytechnic's throwing out some tables and chairs, and you know we need furniture for the switchboard." And he said, yeah. I said, "Well, we could nick them, couldn't we?" Because they were only going out in the tip. So we walked down the street, got a few nice gay men in their pink T-shirts, etc., walked down Oxford Street with chairs and tables and fitted out the gay switchboard. We got the phone lines in. That was easy. It was the tables. It was an amazing period. It was when 1974 or 73 it was, I think, was the first gay liberation front meeting in Shude Hill on the Turk's Head in Shooks Hill. And I went to that meeting, and, you know, people were talking politics. They weren't talking about how do I get a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They were talking about how do we get our rights? How do we stop being unlawful people? How come, you know, if we get a boyfriend, he's not the right age, the next thing is we're committing an offence. You know, the lesbians say we can't walk down the streets without being harassed by people. And we were saying we just can't even walk down the streets. And it was a sort of sense that you wanted to make change. It's always been a dynamic city. That's one of the things I've always loved about it.
Yeah, me too, me too. So this is all the positive stuff, but you did have some tricky times at work in previous roles, didn't you, before you came to the Met?
Well, actually, before I came to the Met was fine because I was just the other person. And everybody thought it was a bit weird, but, you know, when I left the Met, that was when the problems started. Because suddenly you realise that a lack of the correct paperwork, and the minute you started a job, within sort of 8 weeks, 12 weeks, HR was going, we need your birth certificate for your pension. And my birth certificate, I hand it over, they'd say, well, sorry, we can't have people like you. And it really was, you know, from the, you know, you're an absolute disgrace to... in one job where they implied it was that the reason why I'd been dismissed because it was something to do with children. You know, I've heard that so many times over the years from different people about different people in the trans community. It's like the first go-to thing. These people are child abusers. You know, and I've had it said to me online, you know, oh, well, you're a child abuser because you believe in, you know, children being able to see specialists. I'm not suggesting we do operations on them. I'm suggesting they get some support, you know, that sort of thing. And you see it over and over again, but it's also throughout the 90s when we were running Press for Change, which we come up to later. So that's my lifespan, actually. That's me. That's me. That's the change that took place.
There's quite a bit of a jump there.
When I was born, my mother got a letter from the consultant saying, your child is unlikely to make 6 months. No, your child is like a wrinkled old man and unlikely to make 6 months. And I love the fact that I'm becoming the wrinkled old man. You know, but she always said I was never going to work to anybody else's schedule, and she was absolutely right there. But in 1992...
Before we move on to that,
yeah.
I want you to tell me about how you met your wife.
Oh. Sorry, Sarah.
Let's all say hello to Sarah.
Yeah, she deserves a cheer.
I have to confess, on national radio, he wants to disclose far too much. I was absolutely scarlet in my kitchen. You've just told me to be this is on midweek. Oh, God, I hope my mother isn't listening.
Yes, well, I won't disclose any of that. All I say is she was the babysitter of the woman I was seeing at the time. We had a couple of kids. And I walked into the kitchen. I'd known the babysitter existed, but even dropped stuff off at her house, but never seen her for about a year, you know. And I walked into the kitchen and the babysitter was there, and I took one look at her and literally, you know, went, that's the woman I want to live with for the rest of my life. And I think she thought I was the notch on the bedpost for the first 6 months. But after that, you know, she sort of... After that, she sort of was allowed me to stay.
Oh. But he never gets the memo.
The thing about Sarah is that she has more integrity than most people have in their little fingers. She has stood by me in the most appalling time. She has taken shit that should never have come her direction because of me. And she's been the most marvellous partner in crime, in love, and she's been the most amazing mother. And I couldn't have done any one bit of it, I believe, without her. And now you can go, Scarlett, darling.
Can we give Sarah a round of applause? to us about how you got involved with trans rights and
Okay, so
that whole campaign.
I met a trans man called Mark Rees, who'd been outed in The Guardian in a case that he took to the European Court of Human Rights and lost in the late 80s. And got to know him quite well and started to think about the fact, no, this was the late 70s, I think. Yeah. We started to think about the fact that actually we had absolutely no rights whatsoever. People can't understand this. You could be evicted from your home, you could be thrown out of a shop, you could be refused a meal in a restaurant, you could lose your job like that. And all anybody had to say was that they would discriminate equally against somebody going from female to male and somebody going from male to female. And I remember going to what was then the Equal Opportunities Commission here in Manchester after I'd lost a job and said, why can they do this to me? In fact, they sacked me saying, you've done a marvellous job, but we couldn't possibly employ somebody like you. And surely they can't just do this. And they said, oh yes, they can, as long as they treat you equally both ways. And I said, so the only thing we're equal with is the very bottom of the pile. We are the bottom of the pile with no rights whatsoever. And I remember this, you know, these people that are standing there with sort of grins on their face, stupid grins, because they're obviously embarrassed, saying, well, yes. And talking to Mark and saying, surely not. And I had a job which was, I had to leave because I was really going to end up in hot water. They were determined that when they got done for fraud, it would be me going down as the finance manager. And I was not going to do it because I'd gone there and genuinely done my job properly and discovered the fraud. And then nobody wanted to support as it was disclosed. So I left, realised I couldn't get another job easily, and saw this course that was a law course. I mean, it sort of said different things, and I thought, well, you know, I'll never become a solicitor or a barrister or anything like that. It never occurred to me, but maybe I could understand something about the law. And it was 2 evenings a week at Manchester Met, back at Manchester Met. Never left the place, really. Had 3 years in Sussex University, but apart from that, you know, this is home. And started the course and loved it. It was like the thing. Oh, this is something I can actually do. I quite understand it. You know, it's a bit like maths. You know, it's add this and add this and add this and take away that, and that's how it works. And really, really, really loved the course and got to know a lot about the law. And we'd been talking about campaigning and setting up a national campaign amongst the trans groups that there were and things. Mark arranged a meeting with his MP in 1992, who was Alex Carlisle then, and he said, you should set up a campaign, but don't use the T word. If you use the T word, nobody will ever read anything. And that was how we ended up with that name, Press for Change, because it was all about changing. It was about the bloody press and all the things that they wrote about us, that we wanted real change. And we made this up over in a cafe opposite the Houses of Commons. And we've all put whatever money we had in at the time. I think we managed to raise about 500 quid between us to get some leaflets made and some letters printed and send them off to everybody who was going to be elected in the election that was taking place. And we arrived, well, Linda, I think it was, and Mark took the letters down to the House of Commons because we didn't have the money for postage. So we put them all in a bag and they took them down. They said, oh, no, you've got to post them. What do you mean, you've got to post them? We're here. No, they've got to go in that letterbox there. So they came back and we started to ask other people, would they help out? We needed a bit more money for this. And people started to give little bits of money. The community was never asked for very much. That was one of the things we really made us an agreement with Press for Change, was we had to acknowledge we had a community that was really struggling. And so instead of asking people for much money, one of the things we said, because can you give £1 or £2 a month? Because that adds up over a year. Mm. And lots of people, hundreds of people gave that. And at the same time we said, we're not going to ask you to do anything big, because it's all a bit frightening, But how about you write a letter to your MP? We'll write the intro, we'll write the end, you fill in the bit in the middle, send it to your MP. You don't even have to put your name on it as long as you have said, I am one of your constituents. And it was amazing to see people do that and get, realise that they'd done that, and then they could maybe make an appointment to see their member of parliament, and then suddenly you find, what are you doing? You've got a job with the Liberal Party in central office. How did that happen? This was a friend, Hannah. How did that happen? I sort of volunteered in the local office because I could see they needed some help, and that's what I worked in. And all these people with all these amazing talents in the trans community who were really struggling to find work, and like me, had gone back to school often, because if you lose your job, and the doctors tell you that the only way they'll continue treatment is if you are working or being a student, you go and be a student, don't you? So I remember at one point we were doing a survey, and 26% of the community had a postgraduate qualification, and something like 17% had a PhD. This is the trans community, who everybody doesn't look at. But, they were doing it. But when we set up Press for Change, it was tiny at first, but it was incredibly grassroots. There was no hierarchy. Everybody who did the work was called a vice president. So Frank was our vice president for European affairs for several years, and I remember him speaking to a commissioner in Europe, the European Commission, who asked him, how long he'd been doing this work. So he said, about 6 years. And he said, where did you work before? He said, I've always worked in the same place. So, confused. Well, I work for the post office. I'm a postman. He could see his. But Frank did the work. He knew his stuff. He made sure he read the materials. He made sure he knew everything there was to know about the European Union. And that's how you got to become a vice president. We didn't have a president. We decided being vice president sort of fitted with our image. The papers had about us. The idea that we're involved in vice. And I always remember that about 1996 we got this leak from the Daily Mail. It's the only time we ever had a leak from the Daily Mail to us. It was a thing from South Yorkshire Police, and it was a report on Press for Change and what its activities. And it said, and they have offices in Bradford and in Manchester. And we're all going, Christine's bedroom, my bedroom. We all had little desktop computers in the corner. That was all we were. There was nothing for anything else.
There is an amazing theme that's running through all this of how much change you can make with so little resource.
Absolutely.
And it is incredible. Can you just explain what change you did make with
Okay, well, so we started off in 1992 with absolutely no rights at all. I became a lawyer shortly after that because, I think just shortly before that, because Sarah had been refused access to fertility treatment, and I said, we're going to appeal, and they said, you don't have a right to appeal. I said, sodding hell, I'll find a right to appeal, and did, and we eventually had 4 children as a consequence of that, which was a bit stupid.
Which ones wouldn't you have had?
Well, one of them's here.
Don't say that
one. I would have had them all, and more. But it was that realisation, I think that when they refused Sarah access to fertility treatment, and realising that I did have the ability to find where our right to appeal existed and to make sure that we pushed until we got it, was that realisation that the law could be used. So the first thing we did in Press for Change was we brainstormed what would be an ideal case. And we decided the ideal case was somebody who'd just lost their job but been sacked because they were going to undergo gender reassignment, who'd been really good at their job but had been sacked. And in those days, the computer was only what you typed, remember? So it was actually a really unifying thing, because before that, the whole emphasis had been on looking as authentic as possible, as disappearing into being the normal. That was apparently all we wanted, was to disappear. And The thing about just typing, just being words, is you see beyond. You see what a person's thinking, not what they look like. And I think that was one of the most unifying things about the community, was realising what we look like was not relevant. So we asked for volunteers for the cases we surmised. The first case was for this person who'd been sacked from a nice high-powered job, and we found our friend Jane, who became P versus S in Cornwall County Council in 1996 at the European Court of Justice, and we won for the entirety of the European Union employment protection for trans people. It was the first time we'd ever had any rights, and it was done on a shoestring.
Give us a couple more wins, because I want to move us on to sort of present day.
This was one of our big ones. In 1998, the government, after P versus S, proposed the sex discrimination regulations. And this was, it was said you couldn't work with children, you couldn't work with anybody in intimate settings, so that was all the nurses, doctors, care workers, teachers, all gone, and nursery nurses. And it said that we'd only use the toilet of our acquired gender when a senior manager considered us to look appropriate. I'm still wondering whether I look appropriate on that sort of, what is appropriate, precisely. We were furious. We got 2 weeks' notice that they'd been running this bloody consultation, never told us. We got, somebody again leaked it to us. My kitchen table became a mega factory. Kids paid £1 an hour, to stuff envelopes. And we got, within 2 weeks, 800 letters sent to the Department of Work and Pensions and the Minister. And this basically got thrown out the window, absolutely. And you realise that power you've got. So I think we took, we did a petition, the first time we'd ever marched on the streets. Trans people did not walk on the streets. I mean, when we first met Alex Carlisle in 1992, the fact that 3 very tall women and 3 rather short men met at Westminster Station and walked through Parliament Square and stood in the queue to go into St Stephen's Gate at the House of Parliament was like unbelievable. You don't do that because people might be able to see what you are. And of course everybody could see what we were, and the police officers, you could see their eyes were almost cross-eyed as they looked at us all, but we were all in our best, but realising we could walk together. I love the fact that in the middle of that picture, the tallest lady there used to be a Rear Vice Admiral and was commander of the Royal Yacht Britannia.
Wow.
And we won her case when the Crown Prosecution Service wouldn't employ her as a Crown Prosecutor. And they didn't like that. Anyway, we took our petition off to Downing Street. Then we had this case of X, Y and Z. We volunteered our first child to bring her own case when she was very, very tiny. They wouldn't let me be registered as the father of our children. That meant that if Sarah had ever died for any reason, which wasn't going to happen, but just in case, the kids would have been taken into care while they assessed whether I was fit to look after them, because I was a legal stranger in law. So they would have become homeless orphans when they had a perfectly good dad to shout at them and house them. We lost the case, but we'd by that stage learnt how to spin. So we were ready for that morning that we lost the case, and I'd expected to lose it. So we'd spun both sides, but I did 21 interviews at the BBC here in Manchester for everybody came to it, from all over. And basically we spun how the court had actually said the most positive thing it ever said about LGBT families ever, and that was that we were a family. They weren't able to change the British law at that time, but we were a family and were recognised in Europe as a family, which was really important because the next big case they did was, of course, about a lesbian couple who'd been refused adoption, and it was the big win. So, you know, one of the things we did in Press for Change was we had various policies, but one was we worked by making friends, not by making enemies, and the second one was that we would never, ever take away the rights from anybody else. We weren't willing to do that. We were going to enhance the rights of everybody. And, you know, we had some good times. Finally, in 1996, we persuaded London Pride to include trans people. And then I took the kids and my friend, trans woman Faye Presto, Letitia Green, amazing magician who does all the royal family birthdays, came out and did magic for my children all the way round Pride. You know, and you're just going, this is amazing. We're going down Oxford Street and everybody's shouting, we're here, we're queer, and we are going shopping, and Faye's doing magic, and the crowd around her gets bigger, you know, and you just think, yeah, we get to know some really good people in this community, really exciting. That was our first stall at a Labour Party conference. We never had any money. Somebody put us in the ballot and somebody paid for this. Amazing. We couldn't have afforded the £3,000. And the next thing is we get a letter saying, your stall is all arranged. And we're going, what stall? We've got to make a stall, shit. You know? And suddenly you're all making pictures and everything again. But everybody who was anybody, at that point it was newly elected, they came and did the sort of kissing of cheeks. So Sherry Booth, Tony Blair, the lot, they came out, they did it to say the Labour Party supports you. Yeah. The community was getting bigger and bigger. I ran, in 1989, I sent out a letter to my 14 mates who were trans men saying, can we have a network, sort of friendship group? And that newsletter became Boys Own, and by the time we stopped sending it in 2008, I think it got out to about, I used to print 2,500 copies, and we'd had more than 4,000 members. So when I did this, I was about number 13. By 1988, there were at least 4,000 trans men. So I always say, you know, if I need security, I just call the small bearded men out, the gnomes. We were perfectly fit and able to look after ourselves, but we made a series of programmes. So the first one was 1996, The Decision on BBC Two, which looked at a group of trans men going to Holland to see what happened in the Netherlands. Then we made this one in 2002, Make Me a Man. It was the most watched documentary of the year, and it had 2 programmes. And the thing that I loved about it was nobody got to ask us about sex, we didn't do any shaving, we talked about our lives and we laughed at ourselves. And there's one point where I think Lee has a noddy hat on his head, and he's, you know, and I just, every time I see it, it makes me laugh so much, the idea that he was just able to take the piss, you know. I'd say we're just, you know, we can laugh at ourselves, we're not stupid people. In 2002, we also had our first street protest. When I did this, I told you I went to see the psychiatrist, who told me I had to live with Stephen for 3 months and see the psychologist. And in the end, I saw 2 psychologists, and I lived with Stephen for a year before I got the appointment back. And I went to see him, and he said, I will never treat you. You will never, ever live as a man. I'd already been living as a man for bloody 12. But I remember shouting at him, what the hell am I meant to do? Tell everybody it was a stupid, silly mistake? And he said, if needs be. And I went home and really was thinking of ending it. And my GP was outside the house. She'd had a fax. And she was there and she said, I like my patients to be alive. And I'd rather make a mistake with somebody who's alive. So we'll start. I don't quite know what I'm doing. You probably know more than me. Let's do it. And she was right, you know. And I've always since then believed that actually the system that required us to see psychiatrists always was fundamentally flawed. Because most trans people don't need to see a psychiatrist. There are a minority who have mental health conditions, but that's in any community. But we are not, we know who we are, we're not fundamentally nuts. And what I love is it's only taken 43 years or something, but we now have in Manchester a service where people don't need to see the psychiatrist, they see a GP. And that's how it should be. But I remember this protest. They proposed this system that would go right back to that system in the 70s, where you had to do 3 months, which turned into a year. And we decided to organise a street protest. I remember thinking nobody would come. You know, I was going to be at the Royal Society of Medicine with nobody there. And 250 trans people at a time when trans people still had very few rights. We only had rights in employment, not in any other field. Actually turned out on the street. And we were so well behaved, the police left after half an hour, and the people at the Royal Society of Medicine made some cups of tea and brought out trays of it. And we won. And we won the moment a doctor said, the answer to this is exorcism. And I could see my friend Claire about to put her hand up to answer him, and I said, Claire, just let him speak. He's destroying the whole other side. Just let him carry on. And of course he did destroy the other side. But we learned to be real fighters, actually, through Press for Change, to the point that in 2004 we led Pride. And to not, I think one of the big things, lots of people say, was not to have shame. You didn't have to be ashamed any longer. Where are we up to on this? I've got probably through loads of questions.
I need to ask you a load of questions about now, but have you finished this? Because I think there's a big thing in 2005. Here we go.
Yeah.
Let's talk about 2005, because it's a big thing.
Okay, so the final thing, I suppose, for Press for Change, not the final thing actually, but the second to the final thing, was the Gender Recognition Act. We won a case in Europe in 2002, Goodwin and I, versus the UK, where the European Court of Human Rights held that we had an absolute right to personal autonomy in our own development, and that the government's argument that they could not change the birth certificate was no longer reasonable. They ought to get their backside shifted and do it. So we worked with various government departments, and on the Gender Recognition Act it took us 2.5 years. It took about the first year to get them to even think about doing it. But we persisted and we got the act, and it was state of the art at the time. It's not perfect, it was never going to be perfect, but it was either lose the whole thing or get something that 95% of people could benefit from. That was, so we did it. And we all had an amazing experience, because we worked really closely with various government departments and government ministers, and I love the point that at one point some civil servant was had put in some suggestion that we wouldn't recognise gender recognition that had been done in all the European countries. And I'm going, you cannot do that. Freedom of movement rules, blah, 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 blah. And David Lammy walked in and said, what the hell's going on in here? And this guy, much taller than me, civil servant, went, Stephen says, and he didn't even get his words out. David Lammy went, if Stephen says, do it. And I thought, ooh, that's how good we've become. Somebody finally acknowledges we know what we're doing, And just onto the next photograph. This is important because finally trans people could change their birth certificates. That actually we were allowed to form legal families. Sarah and I were able to get married, which I think, it's an interesting day. I mean, it was just wonderful. I remember my mate Richard saying, you do realise, Stephen, here, we're not here for the wedding, we're here for the celebration of a couple who've made 26 years through thick and thin and are still here. And they've got 4 fantastic kids. And we had a great day, but I remember thinking at the end of the day, I just remember Sarah walking in the church and being gobsmacked and thought, I am not marrying the right person, absolutely and completely. This is absolutely right. It only took 26 years to persuade her. But that night, you're sort of like thinking, I thought, what did the Gender Recognition Act, what has it ever given me? Naffle. I've got no privacy. I've given it up over these last 20 years completely in order to do this I can't think of one benefit apart, well, today, getting married, but Sarah was always going to be, we're never going to separate anyway. The real benefit came from the fact that I saw a community come out to recognise, particularly Sarah, for doing the job that she had done for years and finally getting the day that she was entitled to, but also to see my mum sort of go, yes, this is right, this is what I've said all along. If they were going to allow you to do this, they should have changed the law for you. You know, they thought they could get away with half a job. Well, no, you know, and that sort of sense that what we'd achieved for a lot of people, we as individual activists have long given up our privacy and lost many rights along the way, but we had achieved a great deal for the future. South Africa, within days, had passed the equivalent of the Gender Recognition Act. It mirrored ours exactly because we worked with the people there on it, and we've seen it roll ever since, you know. Yeah.
Right, I want to move us on because this is all amazing stuff and really positive, but right now, trans people are in the press a lot, and it's like a new level of attention is being focused on you, and it's not positive, and it's being used as almost a political football or a dog whistle or whatever. What the hell is going on, Stephen? What do you think's going on?
Oh, I'll just put this one in. Taking your mother to the palace. If you get to take your mother to the palace, you've forgiven everything. You have a pass for life. Every misdemeanour is completely wiped out, and you have a seat at the gate side of God, you know, after that.
Noted.
This was a really weird one. Sussex, my old university, gave me an honorary doctorate and made me wear a most peculiar outfit. But then I thought back, I remember these outfits from when I graduated. But this is the sad thing that's now happened. In 2016, Theresa May, who'd read the report that had been done by the Women's Equalities Committee on Trans Equality, said, we need to move forward. Ireland has now created its own Gender Recognition Act. And they don't make people wait 2 years, and they don't make people have to be seen by a psychiatrist and diagnosed by a psychiatrist. And they don't do this, and they don't do that, and we could do that. And she genuinely thought it would be really easy. The backlash has been phenomenal. And I think part of the problem is, it's only now as the years have passed that we've started to see the links. For example, some of the leaders of a couple of the women's groups who opposed transgender, the amendment of the Gender Recognition Act, were off in Texas last week having photos taken with the Proud Boys. You know, and you're just thinking, what? You're telling me you're for women's rights? It's become a dog whistle issue. We've become part of the culture war that the government is running on. We're an easy target for government. This is a government that doesn't want anybody to see what it's really doing in reality. You know, we saw what happened with fundamentally the corruption with contracts in, you know, the pandemic, and I think most people in this country have been really quite shocked at seeing that something they thought happened in third world countries has happened here. But it became necessary for them to, you know, we now have an invasion of Albanians apparently, and we now have these people who want to go to the toilet. And you'll be amazed the focus on toilets. That, you know, there was somebody wrote a whole thing on Mumsnet the other week saying, I went to the toilet and as I walked in, I realised there was a trans woman walking into the cubicle at the end, and I sat there terrified. And she had a pee, and she got up and she washed her hands and she left.
Oh my God!
And you're going, what? Isn't that what toilets are for? You know? It has become. I mean, to the point that as trans men, we've said, if you really are going to go down that line, you'll have me in the ladies' loo, you know. And I'm not that pretty a sight, I can assure you. But it's been an attack on every element, particularly children. You know, the idea and cases brought and crowdfunding for legal cases is one of the worst inventions in this world, and that's as a lawyer speaking, who could go and make lots of money out of it. But what it's done is it's meant that naive people have been persuaded to give their money to causes they don't properly understand, they don't really realise the implications of. So, for example, in the Bell case, that was concerning trying to close down services for children in this country, saying they were given, sex changes at the age of 12. Bollocks. Nobody. But it was just, ultimately, they poured £3 million into donations. Where's that money gone? Which lawyer has that money gone to? Is there any left over? What's happening with that? Nobody knows. And that has enabled a whole body of case law to take place in this country that is absolutely inappropriate, not just in trans cases, in other cases as well. And I think it's... and, the astonishing thing is when you realise how much money the crowdfunding sites make. So, it's been...
Let's just talk a bit about the kids thing that you've touched upon already. Because I think this is a really strong discourse in the media at the moment, that kids are being encouraged to become trans, and encouraged by there being too much education and too much talking about it. So what's your perception on that?
I think there's a lot of things going on. I think there are young people who find, and particularly young girls, who find the pressures on girls to be ultra-feminine extremely difficult to handle. I've known all my life people like this sit sort of on the edge of our community. They've come to events, they've thought about transitioning, but in the end they haven't. They've always been there. But because of the immense pressure on girls nowadays to wear certain sorts of underwear, be a certain sort of person, for many girls, it just isn't who they are. They find it extremely difficult, and they think that perhaps they might be trans. And the whole point of them going to a clinic is the clinic actually explains to them why they're not. Somebody said, all these kids are getting puberty blockers. 4,000 children seen by the Gender Identity Service in London. Of those 4,000, 151 have received puberty blockers at an average age of 15. Now, personally, as a trans person who went through childhood, thinking I couldn't be the person I was meant to be, I look at that figure and say 50. So you've got all these people and all their parents and all these kids, and you are dragging them down a line into a belief that maybe there might be treatment for them, and nobody is telling them, actually go back to school because you'll just waste 4 years of your life here in huge waiting lists and you'll be disappointed at the end. You might get something at the age of 15, which is too late anyway for puberty blockers. They might as well wait a year and a half, get cross-sex hormones and transition if that's what they want to do. But it's that whole thing that the pressure that has been put on girls, I think particularly, has made a lot of girls and their parents think that the behaviour that they have, which is, I do not want to wear that stuff, I just want to live in a grey tracksuit, thank you, that must mean that they're trans. So there's a lot of category errors going on. And the trouble is the hysteria around it doesn't allow us to have that conversation. Yeah. I want to be able to have that conversation in public and say, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? All the research that's been done on children, what does it tell us about them? Because there's a lot of things that we could explain, but we can't have a sensible conversation. That is really sad.
Okay, I'm going to ask you in a minute how we start that conversation, but I want us first of all to talk about the other big discourse that's out there, which is that cis men are pretending to be trans women so that they can assault women. So you gave me a stat. you gave me a stat, which is there's 773,000 adults have reported experiencing a sexual assault or an attempted sexual assault in 2020, and that's 1 in 34 of all women. A total of 618,000 women. That's just in 2020. So Have you seen any examples of cis men pretending to be trans women so they can assault women?
No. We have the two cases, one in the States, one here. The one here was many years ago. It was a trans woman who tried to go to an all-female nude sauna. I didn't realise there was such a thing until I was told by the custody office that they had her in custody. And she was pre-op and she was having a full psychotic breakdown, and when she was treated and well, she was horrified at what she'd done and said, I would never have done that. And I knew she wouldn't have done it. We spoke to the police. And when was this? So that was 2009, I think, 2008 or 9. So nothing since. I actively, every year, survey all the countries which have now got what's called gender identification, gender recognition on self-ID, which is 21 states now. And say, I ask lawyers, I ask organisations, I ask, leading women's organisations, have you got any examples? None, nowhere, nothing, except one in the States, where a man dressed up as a woman in order to enter a women's centre to steal money from the money box.
Right.
But he got caught
so
straight away.
The amount of press around this whole idea, I mean, this is every day that we're seeing this kind of stuff.
It doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because any man can walk into any woman's space really simply. All he has to do is put on a boiler suit or working jacket, pick up a bag of tools and say, I've come to fix the boiler, I've come to fix the toilet. You're let in. It's as simple as that. And I used to work in a situation where, with a bag of tools in my hand, and nobody ever questioned you. Have you got your ID? Yeah, there you are. Walk in. Any man can do that anytime. Why would you try dressing up as a woman? I can't. A very beautiful trans woman who I work with, we had a conversation the other day, and I said, so what time's your plane? She said, my plane's at 7, so I need to get up at about 3. I said, what? You're mad. And she said, do you know how long it takes to put on this face? And I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, you're amazing looking, but actually she does the work for it, so you're not going to do all that work just to access the ladies' toilet when a bag of tools would do just as well. And it's a myth, the idea that, part of the myth that they're doing is that, trans women particularly are trying to take away the rights of real women. And it's been an issue that's come through sort of radical separatist feminism since the mid-70s, and it's just not true. Trans women are the biggest allies of feminist women. And, one of the things I've often tried to say to people is you do realise a lot of women face domestic violence, physical violence and sexual abuse. We know the figures and they're appalling. But if you go and ask the trans community, the figures are even worse. So let's get real here. Yeah. And if you are worried about a trans woman in the ladies' toilets, I can tell you the trans woman who's using the ladies' toilets is far more frightened. Let's have some decent locks on the doors, let's tidy this place up, a coat of paint, put some clean towels in and some soap, and toilet paper. And everybody will be much, much happier instead of the dump that you're currently running in your Royal Mail sorting office. We used to do lots of Royal Mail sorting offices.
So how do we break this down? Because this is polarised, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, interestingly, I do think there is a point now where we can start to begin to talk, and that is the fact that we have seen this huge shift to the right, that we are seeing, particularly men's organisations, in the States particularly, promoting actively this particular set of dialogues that trans women are this and none of us are real and sex is only binary, etc. We've tried to have the rational conversations. We've tried to do the explaining. I'm terribly polite on Twitter. Lots of fans just for being polite. But nobody on the other side is going to listen. But I think it's been really interesting. There have been some real threats made. I am concerned, I have a great concern that one day, either one of these men who somebody says, well, get your guns and go and guard the ladies' toilets. Well, why would you take your gun to guard the ladies' toilets unless you intend to use it on some sort, guns, that's what guns are for. Somebody will do something in the States, or you get some young trans kid here who's really had it up to here, and they'll go and do something stupid. And once that happens, we're on a loser here. So we have to find a way of talking. And I think one of the first things is, and I've reached out to a couple of people who I know who are on the other side and said, look, we disagree, but neither you nor I want to see a Joe Cox scenario where somebody goes and kills Eddie Izzard, for example, because he's standing in Sheffield. Everybody knows exactly who Eddie Izzard is. Everybody almost certainly is fully aware of the form that Eddie Izzard's body takes. And you know what? If Sheffield votes for them, what fucking difference does it? It's none of your business. And I remember one woman said, you're absolutely right. You were absolutely right.
Yeah.
Because it is going to end up with something like that, isn't it? And we have seen now what we have in Texas is parents sending children to school with lawyers' letters which say my child must not be interviewed without their lawyer present. Because the Texas governor has said the parents can have their children taken away from them and the parents can be jailed. He's actually put that into legislation if their children get any treatment as teenagers. And that cannot be the future. We have to find a better way, but the way is only going to come if we can communicate across the barrier. And the way to do that is by saying, this is turning into something really nasty. Let's try and make it into something better than that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Questions for 10 minutes. I'm going to do 2 at a time if possible. Could the people that I volunteered to make responsible for the microphones just turn them on? And then we'll go to this lady here. We've got a question already from Emily at Bruntwood, which is, what one thing would you like to see businesses do to support their trans colleagues? And if you could just introduce yourself very quickly and ask your question.
Oh, hi, I'm Catherine. Can you hear me? Is it on? I'll just speak loud. Anyway, that was really inspiring, Dr. Whittle. It's really interesting. I would be a woman on the other side that you've been talking about, so it's really, really heartening that you're saying we need a dialogue, because I do think, like you, with no debate is not going to get us anywhere. And I want trans people to live their lives, but I do think there are some conflicts with women's rights. We may disagree, but I do think we have to have respectful and open discussion. So I would really like to know a bit more about the next steps for that, please.
Okay, so that's 2 questions. The first one is from Emily at Bruntwood. What one thing would you like to see businesses do to support their trans colleagues?
I think the really important thing for businesses is to remember that we exist. It's very easy. You have somebody who's trans and you start to forget that aspect of them. We become but actually we're going through the stuff daily. This Sunday, I think it's this Sunday, will be Trans Remembrance Day, to have businesses to even acknowledge it in their email things. And so staff who are trans feel that they're welcomed and they're supported. I think it's really, it's simple little things. Nobody's wanting the big massive thing. But I do remember elderly person's day centre up in Salford who put up on a big sort of display celebrating the fact they had a trans woman and 2 gay men went there, and they celebrated LGBT History Month with a big display in the centre, and all the people got involved in doing it. And the conversation started. And the next thing is, they all feel happier in that space. So it's remembering to acknowledge people as being themselves, but remembering that we have parts of our lives that, we celebrate Eid, or we mention the fact that Eid's taking place, or Hanukkah, or anything else that we do. We all do this through work, but nobody mentions things that this is Trans Awareness Week, Sunday's Transgender Remembrance Day. It's called that to remember all the people who've been unlawfully killed each year. Over 350 trans people that we record through press reports. And that's just grown and grown and grown each time, and it shouldn't do. But remembering those people and remembering that we are a community but we're also part of your world. We're not separate. We are very much part of everybody else's world.
Great. And the second question, I'm sorry that the microphone didn't work for everybody, but the second question was about where trans rights clash with women's rights and how could we have a discourse about that?
I mean, I know people feel that there are areas. I mean, I have, 3 daughters, lived with Sarah for 40 odd years. I was myself perceived as a teenage girl. I know exactly what goes on and takes place. I'm aware that I fully understand why women are concerned about men getting into their spaces. I'm concerned about that. And I think, for example, as a trans man, I would never, ever, ever dream of entering a woman's space, because who would want me in there? Except I've had, many years ago, when I was at Sussex University, when I was outed by the dean, which was most unpleasant, the women's group there actually invited me to the Christmas party. And I said, no, I can't come. And they said, of course you can come. Your experience is similar to ours. You supported us. Come to the party. And I went and had a great time, And it's finding ways of being in the same room, I think, is really important. First of all, because I don't think my generation, certainly, and most of the younger, they don't want to fight. We don't want to fight. We want to talk. We want to meet. We want to... And if we could find ways of getting in rooms together without people shouting abuse. So the last mixed event I went to, every time a trans woman spoke, I'm afraid a group of people stood up and shouted penis over what they were saying. That, how can we have a conversation? It can't be. But I think we would, and if you talk to any trans woman, they'd say they're as terrified of the same things as you are, because they don't want men in women's spaces, because they would be unsafe too. And so we've got a lot in common. And I think we could have a really, really, really useful conversation about what is it we are doing to change the next generation of boys. So none of them feel they have these rights to do the things that they do to women. Absolutely none of them. How do we start in primary school? How do we start in reception class? What is it we are going to do when we teach our children to address difficult issues in their lives, to think about how to make difficult decisions? Do I leave this guy who's thumped me? Right through to, you see it in law all the time, people, for example, who do anything to keep a baby alive, and the rest of us are looking on going, why did somebody teach them how to make that decision when they were younger? So I think there are lots of ways in which we could have the conversation, but we first of all have to be prepared to share space. And I think the trans community has always been willing to share space. I have been to endless meetings, whether it's through political groups or with government or just meetings arranged, where we were meant to talk together. And I'm really sorry, but on no occasion did anybody from the other side turn up, except on one occasion, which was to shout penis.
Let's see if we can change that.
Yeah, let's do something about changing that.
So we've got a question from a guy at the back, but the microphones are both at the front. So if you just do a bit of a pass the parcel.
Or shout.
Use the microphone. And if there's one more question, if you want to raise your hand now, this is your moment. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. That was really fascinating. My name's Duncan Craig. I'm the founder and chief executive of Survivors Manchester. We're an organisation working with boys and men affected by sexual abuse, rape and sexual exploitation. The removing of trans people from sexual violence spaces is something that is of grave concern to myself and to my colleagues. Contrary to popular belief, let me tell you that most leaders within the sexual violence field, like my organisation, were welcoming of trans people. But what we're seeing, particularly with my colleague at Survivors Network in Brighton, is a little bit what you were talking about before, is the grifting that's happening around crowdfunding, and actually there's 2 cases going on at the moment where a section of women, cis women, particularly cis lesbian women, are actively trying to close down sexual violence services when we're on our knees already. Only 1% of individuals who make reports around what happened to them, regardless of what time in terms of how old they were, only 1% ever end up in court with a guilty verdict. We're already on our knees. So for me, as an organisation, I am nervous, and I am literally just waiting for that one cis male to walk through the door, and a bit like what happened with Jay in Survivors Network, be told that we're now being sued because that individual doesn't feel safe because we have trans men in our service.
Did he point out we're only 5'2", you know?
20% of the that access our service are gay, bisexual and trans men. My question is, how do we engage in conversations about something that people don't want to talk about, sexual violence anyway? How do we engage in conversations to try and lift the toxicity out of that? Because what we can't have are sexual violence services closing. We haven't got enough already, and we just cannot afford to allow any other services to shut down.
I think we have a huge problem at the moment with a particular sort of, you know, we have a government that is, you know, on its knees too in what's happened, and is not going to push money towards the organisations that need them. But I do think that it's absolutely essential that organisations, particularly who address sexual violence for men and for women, and I know from the work that I've done across the years with organisations that address women as victims of sexual violence, 99% of people are, you know, are supportive of the trans community completely. Absolutely. So we have to find ways of, first of all, banding together, making sure we are looking after each other. I think that's really key. But one of the things I've also learnt is that I often say to the trans community, we have to be cleverer. We can't be aggressive, we just have to be clever. We can't, you know, we're never going to win in money terms, we're never going to win in power terms, but we've got a hell of a lot of brains between us. So actually getting the right people to give legal advice, so when you have attacks like that, thinking about how you're going to address those things in advance, I think is really important. And I think there's probably a place, you know, really now for saying something that's happened in the States is a lot of the trans lawyers really work together on issues. And I've worked, you know, Jesus Christ, I've worked on a case in the Supreme Court in America. You know, I can't do that, you know, as a lawyer here, but normally, but to be able to see that solid working together. And the problem is we have very few trans people in the law. We're all sort of on our knees trying to deal with the issues. But I think we have to find ways in which we really consolidate who we are. And I think that's what Press for Change did. In many ways, as individuals who were in geographical space, we consolidated that we were not just individuals. We weren't just this group and that group and that group. We had a name. And even though that name was very little in many ways, because we did only have computers in the corners of people's desks, you know, offices, we didn't have any money. I think we averaged £2,000 a year over 25 years as an organisation. But when we did need money, we could ask for it because we never asked people for money. That was the first thing. So when we needed to crowdfund, when we needed to get money to insure against losing cases, we were able to ask the community, and they always turned up. But secondly, by having that solidarity as a group of people, we didn't feel individually threatened. We, you know, I think there is a real space for us getting almost like in a physical space and talking about the stresses and strains of dealing with all this, but also about how we might guard ourselves against case law. But we have to do that.
Thank you.
That's amazing. Listen, I'm going to have to call it because the salad's going cold. But this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I can see everybody, you know, we've gone over time, which is poor chairing, but everyone's still completely engaged. I'm just looking at you all and thinking, wow, this has been a really fantastic evening, and I just want to thank you all for coming.
Can I just say something?
Please.
I've been astonished at looking at the number of people I know who've turned out here today, and all I can say thank you very much. I feel very honoured to have so many amazing people as friends, because I know you're all allies, fundamentally. And, you know, many of you have known me a long time and seen this go on a long time. And so, you know, I may have retired, but I haven't stopped. So, thank you.